Okay, let's start. This is the third part of a course by, this is the third part of a class by Bruce Director on Schiller and the 30 Years' War. This is an extremely challenging but necessary subject in today's circumstance. I mean, over the coming weeks and the next few months, we're at a turning point in history. And decisions made over today, tomorrow, and the coming weeks and months will probably substantially determine the course of human civilization for a century or even more into the future. And in the center of that is the American people and the decisions that they are making today and over the coming days. I would mention that the Michigan Republican State Convention is occurring as we're speaking, and this is critical for the alignment of the party and the pro-patriotic, pro-Trump forces control of the Republican Party in Michigan, which is in turn critical for the midterms and beyond. And this is being decided as we speak. Tomorrow are the French elections, which will mark a major change in ongoing history if Marine Le Pen, who is second in the polls, but who knows what those polls mean, if Marine Le Pen as a nationalist candidate on the model of Charles de Gaulle, or modeling herself after Charles de Gaulle, and becomes president of France tomorrow. Now, when we look at history today and tomorrow, contemporary and future history, it appears quite unclear normally, indeterminate. What's important, what's not important, what's going to happen, what relation do the events all have to each other. All these things appear dark and mysterious. On the other hand, when we look back at past history, whether it's recent, especially recent history, like current American history, just past American history, it seems completely clear. The events are clear, the causes are clear, everything seems clear. This is just nothing but an illusion. The reality is, to those who actually understand the causes, present and future history is far clearer than anything that occurred in the past. As we discussed in the first two classes of this series, basically Bruce has discussed at length and with many examples, mostly drawn from Friedrich Schiller and his study and treatment of the 30 Years' War in Europe. It's the great tragedians who are the real historians. The only real teachers of history are the great historians, beginning with the ancients known to us, from Aeschylus, Sophocles, to the moderns, the Renaissance, Marlowe, Shakespeare, and the German Friedrich Schiller, who was an enthusiastic and very effective German supporter of the American Revolution, whose life spanned the late 1700s and early 1800s, was really, even though he's not as well known in America as he should be, and not at all as he used to be. I mean, unbeknownst to many of our listeners and watchers, many American cities have monuments to Friedrich Schiller as a leading pioneer in support of the American Revolution and its objectives in Europe. So it was really Friedrich Schiller who was the successor of William Shakespeare in the art of a tragedy, and therefore of real history. And Schiller went beyond even Shakespeare in what he was able to do in this. So I think rather than continue at the moment, let me hand it over to Bruce. He'll speak. We may have some dialogue between us, and then I expect we'll have a very full and interesting discussion with the rest of you as we have in the previous two classes.
Okay, thank you, Tony. As I promised, tonight we will look at Friedrich Schiller's treatment of the events that we've been talking about for the last 2 weeks through his historical account called The History of the 30 Years' War. We will be looking at those events from the standpoint that Schiller did in a work of art which are known as the Wallenstein plays. There are 3 plays that he wrote in 1798, 1799 period. They're generally, together they're known as the Wallenstein trilogy. They're made up of 3 plays, one short one called Wallenstein's Camp. Then there's a second full-length 5-act play called the Piccolomini. And then there's a third full-length 5-act play called The Death of Wallenstein. And the 3 plays are related. And they were performed at different times. The Wallenstein's Camp was premiered in September of 1798. And the Piccolomini and The Death of Wallenstein were premiered in the first half of 1799, all at the theater in Weimar, Germany, that was established by Schiller's friend and much more prominent at the time, a poet, playwright, historian, Wolfgang Goethe. Now, Weimar was a particularly interesting place because it became the center of what was at that time a real Renaissance period in Germany. People not only lived there like Goethe and Schiller, who both have houses today, houses there, which are now today museums, as well as they're both, they're not buried, their tombs are in a mausoleum, and both the caskets are above ground, and it's a place where you can go and pay homage to both Schiller and Goethe. But it was also, for a time, Wilhelm von Humboldt lived there. Many other playwrights and thinkers who were associated with the Prussian reforms and the transformation of Germany, which was taking place at that time. I might say more about that in a few minutes, but the history then that we're actually looking at is really not necessarily only the history of the period that we were looking at over the last 2 weeks, the period from 1618 to 1648, which is known as the period of 30 Years' War. But as I mentioned, this was actually a 30-year period of a much longer 100 years of warfare in Germany within the imperial system that completely destroyed Germany and most of Europe and led to depopulation of Europe. And as I mentioned over the last couple classes, this was also the period that coincided with the beginning migration from Europe into North America by the people who ultimately created the American Republic. So these plays take place entirely within a short few-week period in 1634, which was the year that Wallenstein was killed, which is 14 years before the end of the 30 Years' War, which ended with the famous Treaty of Westphalia. So the events that are in this play occurred 165 years before the plays were premiered. So that's about the same distance in time that we are today from the Civil War. Now, I'm not making that comparison that the 30 Years' War and the Civil War were equivalent events in Germany and the United States. I'm just citing that for the time span so that you can see that it was these events were as fresh in people's minds as the Civil War is to us today. It wasn't ancient history, it was recent history in effect. And it was very profound recent history because it had been so devastating to Europe in general. So the history we're looking at, in a certain sense, is us looking at the history of Schiller writing these plays, and based on a history that occurred 165 years before they occurred. So this gives us an interesting way to think about it, an interesting perspective, which is characteristic of great art. In all great art, the participants in the art, whether it's an audience of a play or the actors or the playwright, all are participating in a experience which is occurring in a very small period of time, the length of the performance, relatively speaking, which encompasses great spans of time, of human experience. And I'll get to that, come back to that idea in a second. But let me underscore that what we're talking about here is art. Not straightforward history, although history really has to be seen by art, and any historian who is not an artist or doesn't practice the principles of classical art leaves his history wanting. And any artist who writes art without knowing history will leave his art wanting. But we're talking about great art, classical art. We're not talking about Hollywood type depictions with historical epics or historical dramas where historical events are presented with special effects and large casts and various devices to try and create a, quote, realistic, end quote, experience. But we're talking about classical art in which the experience of the audience is to get beyond the particular constraints of the facts and rise to the ability to actually see these events from the standpoint of the actual social interactions which led up to them and which govern the characters on the stage. Now, in the email we sent out advertising this class, I had linked to an article from the year 2000 by Lyndon LaRouche, which is called Politics as Art, which is one of many, many articles that LaRouche wrote where he talked about the principle of classical tragedy and the principle of art as being necessary to being able to understand current events as Tony described. And I would encourage everybody to read that article. It's quite appropriate today, even though it's 22 years old. But what the point LaRouche makes, as the little opening that I quoted in the email makes it clear, was that the real crisis we face right now can only be solved by the citizenry in general and the political leadership in particular mastering these principles of classical art and classical tragedy to be able to rise above the kind of petty thinking and what LaRouche says in that article, common lies that people tell each other and believe that seem to dominate and govern their thinking and the way they behave. I mean, we get on this call all the time and we hear it all the time about how, you know, how do you break through all these lies? Everybody's lying. You turn on the TV and you get nothing but lies. But as Lynn points out in that article, most Americans lie most of the time. They state partial, they either tell outright lies or they say fallacies of composition in order to be able to make a point or win an argument or for some practical gain. And the real question is to be able to actually think about and understand and act from the standpoint of the underlying truth, which ironically is best presented in the form of fiction, i.e. great classical art. And LaRouche makes that point more elaborately and poignantly than I'm able to do in this class. But I think we can at least through the discussion period, delve into that a little bit more. So that's the first thing. We're talking about a work of art, which is based on historical events, but it's not meant to be a depiction, a so-called realistic depiction of the historical events, or some type of substitute for actually studying the history itself. It's meant for an entirely different purpose. Now, LaRouche points out in that article that in the case of classical drama, that the stage and the actors and the presentation of the drama are not in the external to the audience. The actual stage is in the minds and the imaginations of the audience itself. Now, Friedrich Schiller himself was very acutely aware of this, as all great tragedians are, and he felt that through this medium, this was a key to being able to change the political and cultural situation that was occurring in Germany at the time. So just to that stage in your imagination, we're talking about 1799 in the period after the 165 years after the 30 Years' War, which was a period in which the United States had had a successful revolution and establishment of a republic. Europe, on the other hand, had failed in that effort, particularly in the French Revolution. And 1799 was a year that Napoleon declared himself the dictator, basically, of France, basically wiping out the so-called democratic process, or what was supposed to be what is misnamed a democratic process in France. And that really posed a contrast between the way the American people had risen to the occasion and done something that had never been done in the world before, establishing a self-governing republic, versus the European population. And Schiller characterized this difference with a very simple statement in which he said, "A great moment in history has found a little people."
Little, yeah.
He wrote a series of letters back and forth to a Danish prince about how to deal with this. They're called the aesthetical letters on the aesthetical education of man. These are long and very deep letters, but in it, Schiller says that the greatest work of art is the creation of political freedom, and that the only way you can create political freedom ultimately is through great art. And this is where he made his one of the places he made that famous statement about a great moment in history is found a little people, because the people, unless you increase the aesthetical capacities of the population, they will not be able to rise to the occasion. So you have to keep that in mind when looking at all of Schiller's works of art, because that is precisely what he's trying to intervene in. Not, just creating art for art's sake, as is done today, but creating art because of a passionate love for mankind and a commitment to wanting to be able to uplift his fellow man and change them. And that's the reason, one of the reasons why it's so important for us to study the art. Now, so in the intervening period, in the 165-year period between the events in the play and the time in which they were performed, the events in Europe, and particularly in Germany, just to be very brief about it, were somewhat mixed. On the one hand, you had, because of the weakening of the power of the oligarchy, mostly through exhaustion, you had a great flowering of intellectual progress. This was the period that gave us Gottfried Leibniz. It gave us Johann Sebastian Bach. You had towards the end, the developments with Haydn and Mozart, Rembrandt, and so on and so forth. There was a great flourishing of art. There was some liberalization in terms of, in small little pockets of especially Germany and a little bit in France, of trying to implement an idea which Leibniz had, which is that you were going to improve society, you had to improve the powers of the mind. So various attempts were made to create educational systems and educational programs by which ordinary young people would be educated in the classics and sciences and so forth, as opposed to just the children of the oligarchy. So that was going on, and it led to a tremendous amount of progress in science and art, but it was stultified by the continuing persistence of this imperial system. And hence you had this huge immigration, especially from Germany, into the colonies of North America, and then later into the United States. Many of the participants in the American Revolution were German. And of course, you have the famous participation of Marquis de Lafayette and Kosciuszko and others from Europe, who saw the success of the American Revolution as being crucial, not only to the development of America, but to the development of Europe and mankind as a whole. So this is the world in which these plays are being performed. And they're being performed in a city which had sort of been a hotbed of this discussion, Weimar, Germany. So Schiller also wrote a lot, as LaRouche did, on the idea of the play and theater. He wrote an essay called Theater as a Moral Institution. He wrote essays about tragedy and many letters and so forth, which explained his philosophy and theory about it, which I would encourage everybody who can have access to these things to really study. But just to summarize it, he was very knowledgeable and very conscious that what he was trying to do in a play is to provoke the audience in a situation in which they were removed from their ordinary day-to-day pressures, in which he could release their imagination, and in that imaginary state be able to induce them and compel them to experience a way of thinking about history, the world, their lives, and so forth, that they would otherwise not be able to do. And he was very conscious in how he did this. Now, he was not the first playwright who did this. Shakespeare and all the Greek tragedians and so forth did it as well. So the first thing he was intending to do with these plays, and he wrote historical plays he wrote a historical play about England, he wrote a historical play about Spain, he wrote and so forth. But this one is particularly useful or interesting because he also wrote the history about it. And as I mentioned in the first class, in 1987, LaRouche provoked me to do this study of the history of the study Schiller's history of the 30 Years' War, and also the study the play in order to get a real feeling about how this thing actually worked. So again, the first thing that a playwright does when inducing a play is you got to get the audience's attention, and you have to induce them to rise above their surroundings, both their particular surroundings of their life, but also of the theater itself. Now, Schiller does this with certain speeches and openings, which I'll describe. But the best way to do this, I think, is not through Schiller, is because Schiller wrote in German. And so if I were to read one of his speeches as translated by someone else, and I have not translated these myself, so it would not be that accurate. But we do have a beautiful representation of that idea in English that was given to us by William Shakespeare as the prologue to Henry V, which was a historical play in England about events that occurred not long before. So I have it on the screen. I'll do at least try to read it with as little damage as I possibly can. So this is the very beginning of the Henry V, and an actor comes out on stage who doesn't have a role as a character in the play except as what's called a chorus. This is a device that's adopted from Greek tragedy, in which it's kind of like a narrator who comes out and speaks directly to the audience and intervenes in the action by the way he talks to the audience. So this is the opening. Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention. A kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment. But pardon and gentle all, the flat, unraised spirits that have dared on this unworthy scaffold to bring forth so great an object. Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France? Or may we cram within this wooden O the very casks that did affright the air at Agincourt? Oh, pardon, since a crooked figure may attest in little place a million, and let us, ciphers to this great account, on your imaginary forces work. Suppose within the girdle of these walls are now confined two mighty monarchies, whose high upreared and abutting fronts the perilous narrow ocean parts asunder. Piece out our imperfections with your thoughts. Into 1,000 parts divide one man, and make imaginacy puissance. Think, when we talk of horses, that you see them printing their proud hoofs in the receiving earth. For 'tis our thoughts that now, excuse me, For 'tis our thoughts that now must deck our kings, carry them here and there, jumping o'er times, turning the accomplishments of many years into an hourglass. For the which supply, admit me chorus to this history, who prologue like your humble patience pray, gently to hear, excuse me, gently to hear, kindly to judge our play. So I think Shakespeare sort of makes the point. Sorry for my terrible reading, but Shakespeare makes the point that is the stage is not the events on the stage, and the stage itself is not the play. The play is in the stage of the imagination, as LaRouche emphasized. So, and it's the role of the playwright and the actors to do their work to induce an imaginary response in the minds of the audience, which then changes their relationship to themselves and to the world around them. And Schiller also made the point that the goal of a play is that when the audience leaves the theater, they are different people than when they went in. Now, Schiller and all great playwrights and all great dramas have this effect. And one indication of it is that they're able to use the characters and the dialogue they create to in such a way that the audience looking at it from outside the events on the stage in their imagination are able to empathize and relate and get inside the minds of all the actors, all the characters in the play, even though they're completely contradictory. It's a very strange phenomena where you can see in a scene in a play where you might have a dialogue between two different people who have two different dispositions, and yet you can relate and empathize with both of them. As Tony pointed out to me earlier, you know, in Shakespeare plays, you oftentimes have evil characters say the most profound, truthful things. And this is all, this is just another characteristic of great classical tragedy. You experience the idea that there are not good guys or bad guys in history, but that there are human beings interacting with each other and with something that is not seen. And as Shakespeare says in the prologue there, you don't see the armies on the stage. The whole idea is that the drama is not what is seen, but what is imagined. And that the main thing that is not seen, but imagined clearly, is the dynamic which is driving the action and the responses of the people, of which they are not apparently aware, but you are, or you are aware of it as an audience member, but not because the playwright dictates it to you, but because you can now see in your imagination something which is unseen on the stage and unseen in the events that are being depicted on the stage. The other thing that's really crucial, especially for historical plays, and this is very important to understand when looking at thinking about the Wallenstein trilogy, is that which is related to that last point, is that the actor or that the playwright through the play, by touching the way the actors portray the dialogue that the playwright has given them, is able to draw the audience into a world with which they are completely unassociated and unfamiliar. You take the Wallenstein trilogy or this Henry V, right? The characters in this play are generals, kings, princes, counts, people who are involved in momentous periods in history. In fact, as Schiller argues in the history of the 30 Years' War, the events of the 30 Years' War, the decisions of Wallenstein, the decisions of the emperor, all these things determined the history, the life, and the conditions of life for the ancestors 4 generations back of the people who are sitting in the theater watching this. And none of those people, very few, if any, were those kinds of people. I don't really know a lot of details about the audience in the Schiller time, but I imagine it was very similar to the audience that Shakespeare had. And if you go to the Shakespeare theaters in London or read anything about the history, there were, you had box seats where the upper crust would sit, but most of the audience was ordinary people. And then you had a big place in front of the stage, which was between the seats and the stage, where people would buy cheap tickets, and they still have this today, where you stand. You have to stand and watch the whole play from the ground. They call them groundlings. And in fact, in one of Shakespeare's plays, he has one of the actors refer to the groundlings. So this was a very mixed audience of all kinds of people. Well, that was very similar, I'm sure, in Germany at the time. So these people, they don't live a life that of kings, of princes, of generals, of armies. And yet, through the play, they're transported into imagining being involved in the decisions and the reactions of these people. Well, this is crucial for the idea of a development of a self-governing republic. The people have to see themselves as running the show, as being responsible for it, as not being underlings. And in fact, in Shakespeare, one of his plays, he makes the famous, I think it's Julius Caesar, where he says our fortunes are not in the stars, it's in ourselves, for we are underlings. He makes it very explicit what it's about, but the people in the audience have to be able to think like they're responsible for world events. And just parenthetically, I don't think it's I think it's extremely important to note that President Abraham Lincoln's relationship to Shakespeare's dramas and Shakespeare's plays, both reading them, reciting them, talking about them with his cabinet, but also visiting the theater and very much being involved in the theater, which is really essential. So that's an essential part of this. Here you have historical events which are being presented in these plays, which are which were defining, and yet the people had no say over them. And here in the theater, the people are transported up as if they were right there, having to live themselves with the kind of decisions and tensions and dynamics which determined the fate that they then inherited. So, as I said, these are 3 plays. In fact, they're usually not presented all at once. I think several years ago they did a performance of it in Germany over I think 2 days. So it's a very intricate and long process. So I'm not going to describe the details of these plays except to give you a few little hints of how it worked, and then we can get into some discussions about it. So you see how Schiller sort of created the events, because there's several elements which create that event, create that tension. You know, one is the very importantly is the plot, the way the action unfolds and draws you in and keeps you focused. And that has to always be changing, full of surprises and full of twists, but not arbitrary twists, not tricks, not jokes, not things that seem superficial, but that just the development of the characters and the tension, you can't turn away. So that's something you can't describe in an outline, but it's and that's why you can't describe it in an outline, because you really have to see the whole thing unfold. The second thing is the development of the characters itself. And that is done, of course, both basically through, and this is the most important thing, through the language that the dramatist uses to convey both ordinary thoughts and very profound ones, and how people relate to each other. And of course, we know, as for example, from Shakespeare, that many of the common sayings that say that state universal ideas and have become part of our language from Shakespeare's plays, that were uttered by characters in Shakespeare's plays. And the same is true in the German language with Schiller. They're just filled with sayings which today people state over and over again without even knowing, or maybe they might have some reference, that were stated in this play or other Schiller plays or poems. So let me just very briefly just outline how he does these three plays, just so you know what's in them. And if you want to read the plays, there is a translation up on the Project Gutenberg website, which was done in the 1800s by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who is not necessarily the best poet. And I have not reviewed his translation in detail, but even he in his introduction talks about the limitations of the translation. But it's up there for one to read, so that you could get acquainted with the play itself. So the first play is called the Wallenstein's Camp. And in this play, it's a short one. It's one act. It probably takes, less than an hour to perform. But he sets the stage and recounts the whole history of the 30 Years' War in this very simple setting. It's the camp of Wallenstein in 1634 in Pilsen, which is today in the Czech Republic. But at that time, it was in Bohemia, which was where Wallenstein was wanted to become king, but he was the most powerful figure in Bohemia. And this was the place where the 30 Years' War started. And this begins, as I said, in 1634, which is when Wallenstein had refused, basically, after several major victories, to pursue military attacks against the Swedes, and instead began to send out messages, emissaries, to make a peace with the Swedes. And to concretize that, he would have had to break with the emperor. But the very first play is not seen from the standpoint of Wallenstein's himself and his generals, but from the soldiers and the people. And what is conveyed in this through the mouths of the ordinary soldiers, their total adherence to Wallenstein. He's a leader. He wins. He gave me the opportunity to be something, so on the one hand, you have the soldiers who are totally loyal to Wallenstein. Then you have ordinary people, hucksters who are selling things to the soldiers. One guy has some loaded dice. He's trying to entice soldiers to gamble with him. Prostitutes, people who are selling food and materials and stuff like that. Hangers on with the army, which was the only form of economy in Germany at that time during the war. And then you had a priest who comes in, a Capuchin monk, and he comes in and starts blasting everybody, saying, you know, you're here in the army of the emperor who's fighting for the Catholic Church and to preserve the Catholic faith, and you people are acting so immoral, and you're saying you're following Wallenstein, but Wallenstein isn't willing to defend the emperor, and just upbraids people for their lack of piety. And then some soldiers come in and say, you know, we just heard that the emperor is so angry with Wallenstein for not fighting that he's going to put half the troops under the command of a Spanish Habsburg to continue the war. And we're not going to tolerate this. The only guy we're going to follow is Wallenstein. So in just this 1 hour, through the minds, through the mouths of ordinary people, you see the effect. And he sets the stage of what the dynamic is that has taken over Germany as a result of 15 years or 16 years so far of this war. And these are, so that's the first play. The second play is a full 5-act play. And it begins, now the scene changes to Wallenstein's castle, and he's surrounded by all his generals. And he's made the decision that he's going to try and make a peace with the Swedes and break with the emperor. But he needs to make sure that his generals are, and his army stays with him. So, but in the opening scene, the opening several scenes involves some of his generals, and there's an emissary from Vienna, and he comes there and basically, you know, says, you guys, the emperor wants to continue the war, and you're not, and Wallenstein is not fighting, and you need to fight. And these guys say, what are you talking about? You know, you guys in Vienna want to continue the war. We're trying to fight the war to gain a peace. And now's the time to make peace. And of course, the emperor's representative also has with him the authority which he bestows on one of the generals, Octavio Piccolomini, for whom the play is named, the power to actually overthrow Wallenstein if it ever gets proven that Wallenstein is actually going to break with the emperor and sue for peace, which the emperor says would be treason. So the rest of the play unfolds around the idea that Wallenstein wants to secure the loyalty of his subordinates, and he does this by organizing a banquet, or he just tells two of his top generals to secure a pledge from everybody. The way they do it, as I mentioned last week, was to organize a banquet, and before the banquet, they show everybody a document that they want them to sign that says, we will do anything for Wallenstein as long as he's loyal to the emperor. And then they all get drunk and have a party, and they switch the documents and take out the phrase, as long as he's loyal to the emperor, and get everybody to sign it. And Wallenstein sends an emissary or a messenger to be on call to go to Vienna and give the message to the emperor that Wallenstein is going to make a separate peace. And this man gets captured. And so the plot is uncovered, but Wallenstein's not aware of it. And that play ends just at that point. Then the final play, The Death of Wallenstein, begins with Wallenstein and his astrologer looking at the stars and casting his astrological chart, which Wallenstein was a famous believer in. And Wallenstein sees in the astrological chart a favorable conditions for him to move. The astrologer advises him that he's misreading the charts. But that's how the play begins, with this idea of Wallenstein thinking that, well, I don't know if I should do this on principle or if I should do it because the stars are aligned, etc. And then he receives an emissary from the Swedes who order Wallenstein to allow them to take over Prague and rule Bohemia, which Wallenstein balks at. I can't go into all the details of the play, but what happens from there unfolds the tragedy in which the word gets out among the troops and among the generals that Wallenstein has made the decision to break with the emperor and sue for peace. They all break with Wallenstein. He's forced to leave his castle in Pilsen and take refuge in another castle in another town called Egra. And there, the few remaining forces he has become destroyed, especially by an insider who breaks with Wallenstein, kills his top generals, and then kills Wallenstein, and that's the end of the play. So that doesn't do justice, obviously, to the plays, but I just thought I should give you a little outline of what unfolds. But again, coming back to the main point and concluding with this, that it is only through art and great art that one can actually grasp the real dynamics which are determining the events in which you are living, which created the conditions in which you are living, and which will create the conditions that you will be living and your posterity will be living in. And this is why only by the use of classical tragedy can we avoid a real life tragedy.